About a year and a half ago, I uploaded my first ever video, The Island of Irrelevancy. It was about how confusing, overwhelming, and incomplete the new player experience in World of Warcraft has become. Have you ever felt lost in WoW's story? You're not alone. Blizzard has made some changes since then. Small steps in the right direction. Today, I want to take that conversation further. This video isn't just about new players. It's about how WoW's rich history can be preserved and made relevant for everyone. So, as mentioned, in the first video, I discussed how disconnected WoW feels to new players, with confusing starts and unfinished stories, like Battle for Azeroth and Chromie Time's lack of narrative closure. For those unfamiliar, Chromie Time is a system in WoW that lets players choose which past expansion zones they want to level through, allowing some freedom to explore different stories in any order, but with limitations that affect the narrative experience. If you're interested in checking that video out first, there's a link on the screen you can click. An example I used for new players and being confused was starting a new character and suddenly being arrested with Jaina and Kul Tiras without having any idea who she was. That confusion still hasn't gone away. Unlike Final Fantasy XIV, where story progress is tied to a separate main story campaign that can't be skipped, WoW ties story, features, and progression directly to character level. This means you can easily outlevel or miss story content, which makes following a coherent narrative far more confusing. After finishing the tutorial Island Exile's Reach, new players were often directed straight into Battle for Azeroth or Dragonflight content, whether they want to start there or not. This forced path can feel overwhelming and disorienting, especially when they haven't had a chance to explore or understand the broader world first. I had a really interesting conversation about this with Swatorista, one of the most respected voices in the Star Wars The Old Republic community. She's known for her guides, resources, and support for new players, and it just so happens that she's also a relative newcomer to WoW herself. She told me she started with Exile's Reach, then jumped into BFA, moved into Dragonflight, and now she's exploring the War Within. Despite all that, she said, "I honestly have very little to no idea what the overall story is, but I don't feel the same need to do it chronologically like I do in SWTOR or Final Fantasy XIV. And I think that's really telling. Even though she's having a good time, collecting mounts, hopping between expansions, and just exploring, there's no real narrative thread tying that experience together. The game lets you bounce around freely, which is great for some players, but what about the players who do want to understand it? WoW assumes that you're already caught up, leaving newcomers feeling lost and disconnected. It's jarring when the game expects you to have experienced everything already, even if you're just starting out, and that's a huge gap in design. I'll talk a bit more about SWTOR's approach later in the video, but big shout out to Swatorista for her time and wisdom. Check her out if you're even a little bit curious about the game, she's the best. One question I get a lot is, where's the main path? How do I actually follow the story in World of Warcraft? And the truth is, WoW doesn't really have a straightforward main story questline like some other MMOs. Instead, the story is scattered across multiple expansions, zones, and quest lines, and often you're left piecing together what matters while juggling side content and competing patch lines. As one viewer put it, many players feel like they're missing the boat, joining WoW late and struggling to catch up with a story and world that seems to have moved on without them. Balancing old and new content is a real challenge, with many zones feeling either trivial or inaccessible. I recently received this comment from another player who gave WoW another try. They talked about how confusing and jumbled the story feels, especially with characters like Illidan and Saurfang. They pointed out moments where key story beats barely register, like Saurfang refusing to join you early on because he won't work for Sylvanas, something that resonated with the player who didn't quite understand why he had to work with Sylvanas instead of siding with Saurfang. Interestingly enough, you may remember later in BFA as a Horde player, you get to make a choice between siding with Saurfang or Sylvanas, but this is a choice that a new player is simply never going to see because it's so deep into BFA's post-patches. As soon as you hit level 70, which will happen quite fast, your time is up. These kind of experiences perfectly illustrate the problems many players face. Important characters and moments feel rushed, incomplete, or disconnected. It's a prime example of why WoW's storytelling can be hard to follow, and why we desperately need clearer, more cohesive narrative systems. So when you hit level 10, the game nudges you towards Dragonflight now, I believe, so new players end up following that because it's the path of least resistance. But if you want to experience the story from past expansions in order, things get complicated quickly. That's where Chromie Time was supposed to help, letting you pick expansions and level through them chronologically if you wanted to. But even then, you get kicked out at level 70 and the expansions don't offer a satisfying conclusion. Unless you fancy going into Icecrown Citadel and giving Arthas a whack, for example. And that's not exactly good, is it? Now technically, you can freeze your XP at level 69 with an NPC in Stormwind or Orgrimmar to stay in Chromie Time longer, but new players probably won't know about this, and if it's their first character, then they can't do it anyway. That's not a system, that's a loophole. And actually, when I was recently leveling a hunter through the Burning Crusade, I noticed something interesting. I did still get the prompt from Chromie to return and begin the war with him once I hit 70, but it didn't physically kick me out of Outland like it used to. Instead, my XP gains were just reduced to basically nothing. I'm not sure if that's new since my original video, but either way, it still proves the point. Chromie Time isn't designed to let you properly finish an expansion story. So, the main path in WoW, it's not really a path at all. It's a web, a sprawling map with missing signs and confusing turns. And that's incredibly daunting, especially if you want to do it all on one character, with friends, and without getting lost or overwhelmed. It's a barrier that makes WoW feel unfriendly to newcomers and returning players trying to catch up on the story. Exile's Reach aside, I think another thing that could help new players connect is updating the starting race cutscenes. I remember how cool the original race introduction cutscenes were back in the day, and expanding and updating those with more backstory would give newcomers a stronger sense of place and history. We've seen Blizzard try something like this already with the War Within cinematic, which aimed to get players caught up from Legion onwards. It's sad to say, but many new players have to watch YouTube videos or read books just to understand WoW's story. No game should make you leave the experience to grasp what's happening. The story needs to live inside the game itself, I've always said that, not on some external platform. It's obviously a great thing that players can look up what they need to know on YouTube or read books if they prefer that. I just wish things were told in-game too. Whenever new players ask me about WoW, I always hope they have an experienced friend to help guide them, and I feel the same way about Final Fantasy. When I bring up Final Fantasy in videos like this, it's not to say it's the better game, but to compare how both games handle their stories. Neither game is perfect, and both require a guiding hand in different ways. The way I see it with WoW is, you can't care about characters you've never met, and WoW doesn't help you meet them. You can't immerse yourself in a story when you'll never reach its conclusion. I recently spoke with Pyromancer, a long-time WoW lore creator, about this, and he put it perfectly. WoW's story often feels like it's constantly building without a proper payoff. You can only build so much before you need to bring things to a conclusion. That lack of closure doesn't just hurt new players trying to follow along, but it also makes the story feel scattered for returning players. The late great Stan Lee once said, "Every comic is someone's first." World of Warcraft isn't that different. Every day there's someone logging in for the first time, someone who doesn't know who Thrall is, who Arthas was, or why Anduin matters. A good story should welcome those players while still rewarding veterans for the time they've invested. But WoW's design assumes that everyone is already caught up, that everyone's a speedrunner who only cares about endgame, and that's a big part of the problem. Take Legion for example. You can pick it in Chromie Time, but unless it ends with Argus, it's not really Legion, is it? You're not having the same experience as the people who played Legion in real time. You'll be lucky to get through a few zones at best. Even as Blizzard ushers players into new story sagas like The War Within, the narrative still revolves around characters many new players barely know. Jaina, Thrall, Anduin, Illyria. Without context or proper introduction, it's tough for newcomers to feel connected to these characters or understand their motivations, which keeps the story feeling distant and confusing. Recently though, Blizzard has started experimenting with ways to potentially bridge that gap, systems like Story Mode and Lorewalking. I want to talk about these systems and what they could offer in preserving WoW's legacy. Whilst these ideas might seem ambitious, they provide a chance to spark conversation and offer hope for future improvements. Many players have shared thoughtful ideas about how WoW could better handle its story and legacy content. For instance, some feel there should be two distinct paths for legacy play. One that offers a condensed story-focused experience, wrapping up major plot beats of a story mode style finale, like fighting the Lich King or Deathwing, and another that lets you freely explore and level through scaled content at your own pace. Both options would respect different playstyles and storytelling preferences. Some community members have suggested implementing an opt-in, strictly chronological story mode, where players progress through expansions in order, quest by quest, chapter by chapter, similar to Final Fantasy XIV's model. This would help players fully understand the story without needing multiple alts or jumping around between patches, creating a more cohesive and accessible narrative journey. A big addition that came in for The War Within was something called Story Mode, a 1 to 5 player version of the final raid boss with no loot and no real challenge, just the cinematic ending. I gave this a try when I came back for The War Within, and this sounds exactly like the thing I've been asking for, but as it stands, it's only for The War Within's raids and presumably beyond. It's a great system, for people who are already caught up and in the know. For new players, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't close the gap. It just reinforces that the story only really matters or is digestible once you're at the current patch. And what good is that if the player's always lost? I hope this is just the beginning, because the potential here is enormous. Imagine being able to choose Wrath, level through Northrend, and then queue for a story-driven finale inside Icecrown Citadel. A satisfying end to the story you chose to follow. I know it sounds like I'm beating a dead horse with this one, but people have to fight for new players. If we don't make our voices heard, then nothing's ever going to change. And I just can't imagine if this was me on the other end of this. I'd be so confused. And the thing is, Blizzard already have the tools. The NPCs you see in Story Mode are essentially using the same tech as the follower dungeons introduced in Dragonflight. I talked in the original video about how cool it would be to face Arthas with a group of relevant characters. Tyrion, Sylvanas, Varian, all playing specific roles in the story. They've basically built this now. We've already seen the potential of follower dungeons and story mode finales, which can give players a satisfying, narrative-driven conclusion to expansions without the pressure of traditional raids. Imagine expanding this to older content so every story arc gets the send-off it deserves. So the big question is, are they going to use this to rebuild the narrative for players trying to understand the past? Or is this just for the future? Because if it's the latter, that's a real shame to me. Story mode might solve the finale problem for current content, but what about WoW's history? This is where lorewalking can hopefully step in. Lorewalking feels like Blizzard's first real attempt to help players explore the past in a meaningful story-focused way, and I really like this system. You team up with Lorewalker Cho and go back through some of Warcraft's biggest and most recent moments, Arthas, Xal'atath and the Ethereals, in a kind of curated time travel story. What I really like about Lorewalking with Cho is that it's not just watching things happen, you actually get to ask him questions about the characters or places you're seeing. It makes the whole story feel a lot more alive and easier to follow. It's like having a buddy there who actually knows what's going on and can fill you in. This kind of thing is exactly what WoW needs more of if it really wants players to connect with its history. It's charming, it's well presented, and it could be a very important tool for the future. But the more I played it, the more I realised something. Lorewalking isn't really part of the game. It's next to it. You don't encounter it naturally while leveling, and it doesn't live inside Chromie Time. It's just kind of off to the side. And for all its potential, that makes it feel less like a journey and more like a museum tour. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I had a conversation with Novel last year where he actually suggested the idea of an in-game museum, something that would let players revisit stories and moments from across Warcraft's history. And honestly, this could be it. It feels like the start of that vision, a way to learn about characters, explore forgotten events, and experience the game's rich backstory without needing to alt-tab to YouTube. And I'm clearly not alone in thinking this. I've seen players say that lorewalking should become a main feature, not just a side activity. It's not only a good way to level, but also a genuinely good way to introduce new players to the story or help older players catch up. But right now, it's still mostly focused on things that are relevant to the War Within. You've got the Ethereals, who are front and centre in the Koresh patch, you've got Xal'atath, who has been the mysterious villain so far, with backstory dating back to Legion, and then of course you've got Arthas, and whilst his story has been done to death, it's still hugely important. But this is a start, and I'm certainly not here to bash it because I think it's great, but it's still very much tied or focused towards current content and stories. That said, I can already see how this system could grow. You can already imagine in Midnight, maybe Lorewalker Cho can give us some background on Quel'Thalas, the Sunwell, or even the rise of the Blood Elves. Just imagine what this could be if they actually commit to it. We could learn about characters from the past like Vol'jin, Varian, Garrosh, Rexxar, Sylvanas, classic characters, and forgotten storylines. There's unlimited potential here, and for once, Blizzard already has a framework that works. The real question is, will they keep building on it? And the community sees the potential here too. I've seen so many comments, Reddit threads, YouTube replies, all echoing the same idea. Why isn't lorewalking the future of Chromie Time? Because it already does everything Chromie Time was supposed to. People are even asking for things like heroic Chromie Time or lorewalking journeys that span multiple expansions. That's how much people want this kind of story-focused experience. I think there needs to be some serious shake-up and a way to quell the confusion. I've seen so many new and returning players echo the same thing. One viewer told me about a friend who jumped into the War Within after only playing Horde side BFA. He had no idea who Illyria was, why Thrall and Anduin were suddenly best friends, or even why everybody kept talking about this sword in the desert. Chromie Time let them pick a story, sure, but it didn't help them understand anything, and once they hit 70, it rushes them to the current expansion without tying up any of the threads they were following. This is especially clear in expansions like BFA. I've heard from returning players who try to follow the story there, only to be pulled in 4 different directions: the launch campaign, Nazjatar, Mechagon, and the various patch questlines, all competing for attention with no clear order. It's overwhelming and it completely breaks the flow. And that's the problem. You're not encouraged to learn the story, you're just encouraged to skip it. And that brings us to Chromie Time, a system that had so much promise and delivered almost nothing. When Chromie Time was announced in Shadowlands, it sounded like the perfect solution, a way to finally experience each expansion's story from start to finish. Of course, it's great that you can choose the expansion you want to level in, but as mentioned, it falls short of delivering a complete, satisfying narrative journey, especially for new players hoping to experience a story from beginning to end. But in reality, if it isn't clear enough already, Chromie Time is broken. In Wrath of the Lich King, you get to see the iconic Wrathgate cinematic, but then the story stops with no payoff. It's like reading the first 2 acts of a book and being told, you can't finish it. The same happens in BFA. You can clear all 3 Kultiras zones, but you're never going to see Ajara, Mechagon, or N'Zoth. I read a comment from a new player who said they didn't even know what Chromie Time was until they watched my video. And that just sums it up, doesn't it? WoW doesn't just fail to tell its story, it fails to even explain the tools it gives you to try. You're just told onwards and upwards, even if you're halfway through critical story moments. The game calls you champion before you've even finished a single expansion story. How can you be the saviour of Azeroth when you haven't even finished a single expansion story? Some might say it's just a label, flavour text that doesn't impact gameplay, but it's more than that. It's about immersion, it's about feeling like your journey matters, that you've earned your place in the story. When the game hands you a heroic title before you've even faced the challenges that earned it, it breaks the narrative and it can make the whole experience feel hollow. And I know not everybody cares about this, and that's fine, but storytelling can be more than just cutscenes and quests. It's about making players feel like they belong in the world they're exploring. For new players, this disconnect is huge, and it makes the story feel less rewarding. You haven't earned that title, you haven't saved anyone or done anything heroic, you just showed up. And suddenly, everyone's acting like you've been here all along. Chromie Time was supposed to celebrate WoW's legacy, but it turned into a glorified XP path with no satisfying conclusion. From a new player's perspective, it can seem like the story isn't really designed with them in mind. One common player request I've seen is the ability for max level characters to properly scale down into old zones, not just to breeze through them by one-shotting everything, but to actually experience the content as it was meant to be played. Imagine toggling an option that lets you revisit these classic stories with meaningful challenge and immersion, all on your main character, without having to level multiple alts just to catch up. This highlights a tension in WoW's design. Some players want stories and immersion, but the game prioritises endgame content and gear progression. Bridging this gap is essential if WoW wants to preserve its legacy and keep both new and veteran players invested. And it's quite clear that the longevity of World of Warcraft has become a hindrance to it. I don't think Blizzard ever thought much about bringing new blood into the game or the preservation of it, and that's why so much of the game and world has been left to rust. Blizzard's philosophy has always been on the here and now. That's why boosting became so prevalent. The much loved levelling, adventure and progression players used to love is something Blizzard have really lost sight of. Of course, many players love the freedom to level fast and focus on max level content, and that's totally valid. My point is simply that there should also be a meaningful option for players who want to experience the story fully. It just sadly feels like a thing of the past now, and they just want you at max level as quickly as possible. And I get that. It's new, it's shiny, it plays better, but it's extreme whiplash for new players coming into the game who are trying to figure things out. Not everyone is a speedrunner, and it's only now they're trying to walk things back and help players a bit better, and I do commend Blizzard for that. But this is just the beginning of a very long road. I would suggest tearing down Chromie Time entirely. It's fine to keep it as it is, but I think we need to start offering a better avenue for players to understand. It's just not serving its purpose, or what I believe to be its purpose anyway. I think if you enjoy levelling in your favourite zones, then more power to you. I don't want to take that experience away from you. If you want to level in Nagrand, the Grizzly Hills, or God forbid, you want to level in Vashj'ir, I want that for you. I just want a cohesive story experience for new players too. And it's not just new players who feel the impact of this. I got a comment recently from someone who came back to WoW after almost 7 years. They just wanted to quest through Durotar, Elwyn Forest, or the Barrens like they used to. but instead, the game forced them into Exile's Reach, gave them a full set of armour at level 10, and then sent them off to the Dragon Isles. This is someone who wants to play the game, and WoW makes it harder than it needs to be. You might still be watching at this point and shaking your head thinking, Ed, nobody gives a shit about WoW's story. And you might be right to say that. Some players don't care anymore. But fans of other MMOs like SWTOR or Final Fantasy XIV are used to rich, accessible narratives. When they come over to WoW, they naturally want to understand the story and the world, but Blizzard simply doesn't provide a way to digest it. This is exactly where something like Lorewalking could succeed, by giving players curated storylines with proper endings, instead of cutting them off the moment they hit a number. And that's exactly why this system needs to change. For new players, yes, but for returning ones too. And Blizzard actually seemed to agree. At Gamescom, they announced a revamped new player experience for Midnight. Their words were, whether you're completely new, coming back after years away, or already caught up in the war within, they want you to be able to jump in, understand what's going on, and join the action. The new funnel looks like this. You still have Exile's Reach, then into Dragonflight and its full campaign, followed by a condensed version of the war within, with all the major story beats stitched into one questline. And finally, you'll be sent into Midnight. For new players who are a little higher level, but not quite ready for Midnight yet, Blizzard is also introducing a new experience in the Arathi Highlands. The idea here is to reteach core mechanics, give some story context, and basically prepare you for the jump into Midnight. I think the biggest takeaway from this is the condensed War Within storyline that will feature post-patch content like Undermine and Koresh. Some players may have found these zones boring, or maybe it wasn't their thing, but they are very important for the overall narrative. As mentioned with Chromie Time, you never see post-patch arcs. You get the leveling zones, but the really important stuff, like the Nazoth finale in BFA or the Siege of Orgrimmar in Mists, it just vanishes. So the idea that Blizzard might finally be building post-patch content into a curated storyline, it's a pretty big deal. I understand they're also adding NPCs to Exile's Reach in Jaina, Thrall and Rathian, so new players can at least meet these characters now. That's something, but at the same time, it also feels like Blizzard is doubling down on the latest two expansions while the other years of history remain fragmented and disconnected. So yeah, progress is being made, and I'm glad they're actually doing something about it, but the bigger question is still the same. What about everything else? What about the past 20 years of Warcraft that new and returning players deserve to experience? And I know some people will say, just play Classic, but Classic isn't the same. It's its own experience. New players coming in through retail expect modern systems, pacing, and structure. Dropping them into a 20-year-old version of the game isn't a solution to retail's problems. I thought I'd throw Timewalking into the mixer too, as I think it should serve as a love letter to WoW's past, a way to relive the best moments of each expansion and keep them alive, but honestly, it just doesn't. It's a rotating schedule of a few dungeons, maybe a raid if you're lucky, and that's it. If you compare that to something like Final Fantasy XIV's Duty Roulette, over there, all dungeons and raids are always part of the queue because the game scales you down to fit them, and people want to do them. Not because they're chasing nostalgia, but because the rewards are still worthwhile. It means content from 10 years ago is still alive and buzzing with players. The difference is that Final Fantasy XIV's scaling isn't a temporary gimmick, it's built into the core of the game. WoW's approach of Timewalking feels like an afterthought. WoW's Timewalking feels like bringing down the Christmas decorations and then shoving them back in the attic. I think we can use WoW Remix as a good example. When Blizzard offered a chance to replay an entire expansion with fresh rewards and admittedly some crazy scaling, players jumped on it. For weeks the old zones were alive again, not because of nostalgia alone, but because the content was relevant, fun, and rewarding. That's the kind of energy Timewalking should bring, but instead we get a tiny rotating slice of what's possible. To Blizzard's credit, they've started pulling older dungeons into the Mythic Plus rotation, and that's a step in the right direction. But Mythic Plus is still an endgame treadmill, not a celebration of the world's history. Outside of mount farming or achievements, there's no real reason to go back to older content. The world feels like it's been carved into these little slices of past and present, and Timewalking just highlights how disconnected it all is. Why not take the Final Fantasy XIV approach and make all old dungeons and raids scale, not just a handful for Timewalking? Imagine if WoW's entire catalogue of dungeons and raids was available in a queue, with shorter story mode versions of raids for players who just want the narrative. It would instantly breathe life back into the world, give new and returning players a bigger pool of content, and break up the monotony of the current system. Blizzard keeps talking about the last 20 years of WoW and the next 20, but so much of that history just sits there collecting dust. There is so much to discuss, and plenty of ways Blizzard could improve WoW, but some players feel it's just beyond fixing, that it's time for a complete do-over with WoW 2, so I want to share some quick thoughts on that. Many talk about WoW 2 as if it's the silver bullet, the one thing that could fix all of World of Warcraft's problems, and it's obvious why. The game is confusing, it's layered with nearly 20 years of systems and stories, and it's just not easy to jump into. There's a lot of excitement and potential with something like WoW 2. A fresh start with new possibilities. But the reality is, WoW is more than just a game to a lot of people. It's a world many of us have lived in for years. I sometimes describe it as a body of work. Rebooting means risking all that attachment, connection, and history. Blizzard seem to understand this too. Their recent efforts suggest they're not ready to throw away what's built, but want to build on it. So while WoW 2 feels inevitable someday, what we really need is Blizzard to invest in making the WoW we know and love better, richer, and more accessible for everyone. There's also a risk that Blizzard might shift focus too heavily to a new project and neglect ongoing support and improvement for the current game. This could leave WoW's vast history and loyal community behind, similar to how Final Fantasy XIV entered a maintenance mode while A Realm Reborn was being rebuilt behind the scenes. It would be a shame to lose the potential that still lies within WoW today. In a lot of ways, I think we've been living in WoW 2 since Legion. Legion was the turning point, the introduction of borrowed power, Mythic Plus, and a real shift towards a more seasonal game that feels more akin to an ARPG than an MMORPG. The game we play today is not the same MMO it was in 2004, or even 2010. It's faster, more formulaic, and more focused on seasonal resets. And with features like player housing now coming in Midnight, I feel like Blizzard is doubling down on this modern identity. A real successor to WoW is inevitable one day, of course it is, but I don't think it's happening anytime soon. And honestly, I don't think Blizzard can afford to gamble on it. I've said this before, but I felt compelled to keep playing WoW, even when I was burnt out and my friends had moved on, because of all the time I've put into my character, and of course because I love the game. The achievements, the mounts, the reputations, the titles, that's my history. It's a body of work, and I think a lot of players feel the same way. Of course, some people still play simply because they love the game, but for many, it's the sunk investment that keeps them logging in. And whilst I don't think sunk cost should ever be the reason to avoid a do-over, Blizzard clearly aren't going to start again anytime soon. WoW 2 could be a hit, but it could just as easily spell the end. Season of Discovery was absolutely glorified, but how many of you were looking for the door when the Sunken Temple patch dropped? Some players can be very fickle, and Blizzard knows that. I'm not saying we don't need WoW 2, or that you're wrong for wanting it, but what we need right now is this version of WoW to embrace its history, respect its world, and give players, both old and new, a reason to care again. So what can WoW actually do? I know many will say that Blizzard focuses more on revenue-driving content than storytelling, and that's true. Endgame content drives engagement, so Blizzard prioritises expansions and features that keep the lights on. But with smart design, legacy content can be both meaningful and engaging without cannibalising core revenue drivers. It's helpful to look to other MMOs for inspiration on balancing story and leveling. For example, SWTOR lets players experience expansions mostly in order, using level scaling to prevent getting stuck, with story-friendly dungeon modes for solo or small group play. Final Fantasy XIV offers a new Game Plus system that lets players revisit completed storylines, including main scenario and job quests from past expansions, in chronological order if they choose. You keep your current character and level, but replay the story at your own pace, with the option to skip cutscenes you've already seen. It's a way to relive the narrative without starting a new character, though it's purely for story purposes and doesn't grant any new rewards. Another thing I've mentioned before that Final Fantasy XIV has which I really like is the Unending Journey, which logs all completed quests with cutscenes, allowing players to go back and watch them again. It's a great feature that keeps the story in-game instead of relying on external platforms like YouTube. I think back to Noble's idea of a WoW museum, where players could revisit major cutscenes from across expansions, experiencing key story moments like the Wrathgate or the Darkspear Rebellion. Blizzard could take inspiration from these systems. Combining Final Fantasy XIV's structured, immersive storytelling with SWTOR's flexibility could help WoW create a leveling and story experience that welcomes new players and respects their time, without forcing them into confusing or disjointed content. In that same conversation, SWTORista also shared how SWTOR handles story progression. and honestly, it helped me see why so many players hold that game up as a gold standard for narrative accessibility. She explained that SWTOR uses level sync to keep content balanced. For example, if you're level 45 and go back to a level 30 planet, your stats get scaled down temporarily, but you still have your full toolkit, and you get rewards appropriate to your level. You're never punished for going off the beaten path. You also don't need to complete old storylines just to access new content. Once you hit level 80, you can just jump straight into endgame or flashpoints. No mandatory story gating like in WoW or Final Fantasy XIV. But the real strength is in how SWTOR lets you play every expansion in order, and gives you the freedom to either move forward or stay immersed in the one you're currently in. She also told me that you can complete story-critical dungeons solo or using a companion without needing a full group. It's not quite like WoW's follower dungeons or Final Fantasy XIV's trusts. It's a more flexible system designed to let the player experience the narrative without being blocked by logistics. And honestly, it sounds like the best of both worlds. This kind of approach, story first, but flexible and opt-in, is exactly the direction I think WoW could benefit from, especially for players who do want to follow the narrative from start to finish. And I think it's great to take inspiration from other MMOs. Competition breeds excellence, and once upon a time, Blizzard were the kings of this. But so much has changed, and I think the new player experience is a testament to how out of touch they are, or have been in recent years. Right now, endgame is the only beat for WoW's heart. Everything else tends to get sidelined or forgotten. And that's really sad, because there's so much richness in the world, and it's stories that deserve more attention. You might still be watching and think I'm delusional, but I'm not. I see the reality, of course. Revamping old zones or finishing expansion arcs doesn't drive metrics the way seasonal content or expansion features does. We kinda saw that in Cataclysm, when Blizzard overhauled the entire world and most players just moved on to the new zones. I understand, the wheel doesn't stop turning. The first video I made was essentially a dream factory. I never thought we'd actually see any real changes, but systems like Story Mode and Lorewalking show that someone at Blizzard is at least thinking about it. Lorewalking has shown real promise as a way for players to explore Warcraft's history and stories in a curated, accessible fashion. It shouldn't just be a side activity or tied solely to current content, because it's capable of so much more. I think Blizzard needs to make it a core part of the leveling experience or integrate it fully with Chromie Time. Expanding the content and making Lorewalking a permanent, evolving feature would be a huge step towards helping new and returning players connect with the story. I also think it's very important that Blizzard expands story mode finales beyond just future raids, allowing players to experience satisfying narrative conclusions for older expansions, like Wrath, Kata, and whatever else they want to explore. This would give every major story arc a proper send-off. We've already seen the potential with follower dungeons and story mode, now it's just time to apply it across the board. And if Blizzard really want to bring the old world back to life, they already have another tool, level sync. We talked about it with SWTOR. Final Fantasy XIV uses it everywhere, in dungeons, raids, world events. It keeps older content challenging, rewarding, and relevant. WoW already has a version of this. You've seen it in Timewalking, in Remix, in Chromie Time. Admittedly the scaling is cooked, but it's there. The tech exists, Blizzard just refused to use it consistently. Imagine being able to queue for a scaled version of Icecrown Citadel or Blackrock Foundry where you actually play the mechanics, or a run through something like Naxxramas in The Last Titan with the Northrend revamp. Maybe even tied to a modern Scourge event, where clearing it deathless rewards you with the Immortal or Undying title again, or having new mounts, toys, cosmetics. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, just give players a reason to go back and make sure the content holds up when they do. World of Warcraft has 20 years of content just sitting there, waiting to be rediscovered. All Blizzard need to do is give players a reason to care, and when you respect the story, the world, and the players who want to experience it, you make the game and the world matter again. And the thing is, this isn't just about new players discovering Azeroth for the first time, it's about building shared experiences that bring veterans back too, giving returning players meaningful reasons to revisit old zones, to relive the moments that made them love the game. Only this time, with fresh rewards, modern tech, and storytelling that actually ties together. You might not agree or care about some of these suggestions, and that's okay, but it's just painfully sad to see how much potential this game is still yet to tap into. With the right commitment and vision, Blizzard can turn Azeroth into a world that actually feels alive again. A world where every player, new or veteran, can understand and feel like they belong. When I made the Island of Irrelevancy, I didn't expect it to strike such a chord with players. The conversations you shared proved that this isn't just a niche concern, it's something many care about. That's why I wanted to revisit this topic. WoW can do better, and you've shown me how much people still care about its future. Story Mode and Lorewalking are good ideas. They show Blizzard knows there's a problem, and that they're starting to think about how to fix it. But systems like Chromie Time were meant to be that fix, and instead, they've become a roadblock. This isn't about nostalgia, it's about giving players, new and old, a world they can understand. And I still believe that WoW can be that game. But Blizzard has to commit. Right now, it feels like a theme park where players zip through content without connecting with the world. This disjointed narrative reduces Azeroth to a backdrop for questing and grinding. Fixing this disconnect is essential to making the game feel alive again. Blizzard is trying to make things better. I'm hopeful for real improvements ahead, but WoW must integrate storytelling at all levels. Expand story mode to give each expansion a satisfying conclusion, and make lorewalking an evolving feature in leveling. By using level sync and offering players a choice between guided paths or free exploration, WoW can deliver an immersive experience for everyone. I see incredible potential here, and I want Blizzard to capitalise on it. I understand these changes might be unlikely, but you have to dream a dream, right? So, these are my thoughts. What do you want to see? Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you're new to WoW, please share your experiences in the comments. We're still stranded on this island of confusion, but with systems like Story Mode and Lorewalking, Blizzard is building a bridge. It's far from complete, but it can be. WoW doesn't need to be perfect to be worth exploring, it just needs to give players a reason to care about the journey again. A huge thank you to my supporters on Patreon, your support means everything and it helps me keep making these videos. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a link in the description below. And a big thank you to you too for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.